co-optation of
All right, well, welcome back. One of the things that we've been doing for the past few years is we've wanted to create enough space in our conference to allow the presenters to talk to each other and to have enough breathing room for discussion and questions. And so this is what this session is designed to do. And so we've invited each of the presenters from this morning to be together and have a discussion. I think it would be appropriate for those who might not have been able to attend one or the other of the sessions to have each of the panelists just give perhaps a 3-minute recap of their presentation. I know that's asking a lot among academics, but just to give all of us a taste of the primary issues and questions that you addressed. And then we'll open it up. We have about 45 minutes, and the same ground rules apply to the question and answer session. We want it to be productive. We want the questions to be succinct and give everyone enough time to weigh in. So, Gina, do you mind just starting with maybe a 3-minute recap and working our way down the panel?
I argued that there's no such thing as a gospel culture. Do you want more details? That the fresh wind of the Spirit that the church needs to be enlivened in the body of Christ, as a body of Christ, will only come when we actually begin receiving the wisdom of the margins rather than continuing to send Utah culture as the only wisdom that Mormons need to live into.
I presented on, I think, a number of things, but I think what I was focusing on was within indigenous communities that faith in the church or faith in the gospel doctrine can actually also serve as resistance to whatever culture may be coming from Salt Lake City, and that indigenous people can actually reclaim ownership of the politics of conversion and also that negotiating space with Mormonism.
I'm a historian, so my comments were geared towards the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And I was focused on how there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of context, that the Navajo reservation itself is changing, that there are Native people with different attitudes as Red Power is rising up. And it's in that context where you have the Mormon effort to colonize Native Americans. And so to really understand what's going on requires a little bit of awareness of the context and how lots of parts are changing and moving. And it's really a complicated mess at times to try to disentangle what changes there have been.
Very good. Questions?
Okay, I served my mission in Hawaii years ago, and one of the greatest compliments I received was at the end of my mission when someone asked me if I was local, because my Japanese skin had come out really dark, and I was speaking Pidgin. It was more natural to me than this Utah English. And the question I have is, where do you see the line between embracing, loving, learning from, emulating a culture, and cultural appropriation? And how should those boundaries be understood within the churches as some of the things that you envision start to happen or might happen?
Do you want to answer that? I'll get to it, Lloyd.
Thanks. I'll take a stab at that. I think one of the things, so recently I've been doing a lot of, well, not recently, the last couple of years, 10 years or so, been working a lot with the Navajo Nation. I was head of their natural resources department. I was a senior advisor to the president of the Navajo Nation, and most recently have done a lot of activism work around the Bears Ears and a number of other things, including Standing Rock, and right now working together with a series of leaders of communities of color through the state of Utah to actually create a voting bloc. And why I bring that up is that in every one of those contexts, I'm pushed against these notions of cultural appropriation and what that means. And I'm guided, at least for me, on two fronts. One, an understanding that there has to be some measure of cultural sovereignty or autonomy that individuals within the tribe ought to be able to determine for themselves what is theirs. And when that is taken, and so for me, the line is when that is taken without permission or respect of that. And when I say respect, I mean respect on the terms granted by those who hold those rights. Because oftentimes I will hear, like with the Redskins, oh, it's a measure of respect for your people, the mascot. And I'm like, no, it's not. If you understood the history and legacy of that term, you would see clearly it is not about respect, but rather it's about power and ensuring that you have maintaining control over that. And so it's difficult, and in my mind, it's context dependent as well. There's no very clear line of saying this is it. I don't know, Gina may have a more cogent response.
I do. No, I don't. I'm kidding. I think we find that in New Zealand, Lloyd, that the missionaries adopt a bit of a brogue, and a sort of a Maori sort of American blend, an accent. And my first thought is, I think it's kind of cool that they're receiving something from the culture, but my concern is if that's the only thing that they receive. A new kind of a swagger, a new kind of an accent, without actually experiencing a different way of being in the world. So that's kind of cultural imitation. And I think that we do that naturally. We adopt as we go along, as we open up to more complexity, we adopt compound worldviews. But I think Moroni is right. When the colonizer takes control of the meaning of that, then we have a problem. That's called cultural appropriation, when they won't let those who are sovereign, culturally sovereign, to control that meaning. That's different. And kind of on that note, I would like them to, it would be nice if missionaries took more than just the accent home.
Can I add to that? So in the placement program, there were children, the numbers I read to you earlier about people feeling like it empowered them and gave them identity, right? And you got to wonder what's going on there. And that borders with this issue of appropriation, that you'll have students that are Native that are in a white foster home that then will become the poster child for what it means to be Native. And they'll go to school and they will give a demonstration of something that may have learned on the reservation, or they may have learned from their white foster parents about being Native. And this entrenches in them, I think, this idea that I'm different, I'm Native, and they become this novelty even, I think, in their schools, in their public schools here in Utah or wherever else. And that's in that same vein, I think, of appropriation, because now they're serving a function to demonstrate, look, here's a good Lamanite that has followed the program, and they still have their Indian heritage because they can speak their language and they wear some silver. And so that's a good, and so there's the borders of a good Indian and appropriation, I think, are tied up in this, who's shifting and designing what this good Indian is.
My question for you is, I've seen a lot of themes about kind of Western culture, or if it's LDS culture, like if it's Mormon scripture that is the main that's the center of these cultural issues. So my question is, what is the central cultural issue? Is it neoliberal or is it theological? Does that make sense?
In Mormonism.
Yeah, in Mormonism.
Are you talking about what's our conundrum? What's the thing that we're grappling with, or?
Yeah, just because, like, when I see, like, the business suits in other country church meetings, I wonder if is it really about, a doctrinal justification, or is it just about a neoliberal ideal that's spreading throughout the world? And is Mormonism just taking a part of that?
You go.
Well, from what I see, I think it's a bit of both. I think at least from what I understand, there's a very neoliberal interpretation of doctrine, and that's where you begin to have a lot of these epistemic tensions when it gets into at least Native communities, because neoliberalism is premised on very specific assumptions about the individual, very specific assumptions about what they can become and what they can do and how they interact, a very specific set of rights that kind of flattens out everyone, and so it brings new meaning to the notion of child of God. Child of God is no longer about celebrating diversity and difference. Rather, it's about becoming a single entity, a single cookie cutter shape of someone from Salt Lake City. And I think those are kind of at the roots of neoliberalism. And so when that then gets kind of used as a lens to interpret the gospel, that is where a lot of this friction begins, at least that I've been contending with for a long time, is that I dress the way I do, not in response to Mormonism, but in response to Navajo traditionalists who are also arguing about a very specific way of how to be Navajo in response to all this colonization. It aggravates that the Navajo elders that I wear a bow tie. And that's precisely why I do it. I used to have long hair to aggravate the Mormons, but they made me cut it when I was at BYU. That's a long, horrible story. And so that's kind of what I think. I think it really, in part, it's this neoliberal interpretation of the scriptures, of the doctrine itself, which, I mean, if you look at kind of the evolution of the meaning of doctrine over time, it's shifted. It's shifted. Anyways, those are kind of my thoughts on that.
Do you have anything, Nick?
No, dress code, I'm thinking, it reminds me of, there's a pamphlet that's in the BYU archives from the 70s about what a good Indian is. And it has a sketch of the good Indians, the white shirt and tie, and looking happy in the mirror. And then it has an alternative sketch of a downward facing Indian. And these ideas of appearance are definitely part of the equation in colonization, absolutely.
And I suppose my response to that would be that it's very difficult to find out, to discover where the differences between neoliberal politics and white Western colonial patriarchal capture of the church. There's a way in which those things have been massaged into our doctrine and our theology, and the kind of interpretations of scriptures, which are all too often proof-texted, give weight to that interpretation, to the question of prosperity being an indicator of righteousness and good Mormonhood. It provides a framework with which to see the movement of time, the quantification of things, how things need to be resolved. And so all of these frameworks get shot through Mormonism, and it happens at the centre because, you know, America is the sort of the centre of, you know, the cultural centre of the project of, you know, globalisation and the westernisation of the world at the moment. So I mean, I suppose my response would be, I think that our next question is, as I said in my address, is to come back to the heart of Christianity and say, what is not useful as people who want to be disciples of Jesus? What is not useful? Are the suits useful? Are the multiple piercings? Is the question of gay marriage, is that useful? Like politicking this thing all around Utah and throwing it out to the rest of the world? Like, who cares? When we're talking about a relational Christianity, none of that matters. When you're talking about a moral, legal framework for understanding your Christianity, then you're talking about suites of rules and behavioural pressures, etc., etc. So we need to say, is that useful? Is that useful for the heart of Christianity to thrive? And I would argue, no, it's not. I think what it does, it contains a community, it gives us a sense of identity and intimacy with each other, but I think we're going pear-shaped with that kind of intimacy. We're turning into an enmeshed culture, a deeply enmeshed and unhealthily so enmeshed and homogenous culture. And so, you know, right now we're kind of struggling with how we break out of that.
Thank you. Over here.
So I think that when we're talking about, you know, this discussion on proselytizing, we're defaulting to an idea of white Mormon kids from the Jello Belt going abroad. And while that's certainly the majority, probably, I would like to know your thoughts on local missionaries. And do you think that it's more useful, or do you think that local missionaries are just also kind of adhering to Intermountain West gospel culture?
I think we need to look at the system. The system is intractable. And the system comes from here. And it doesn't matter who's participating in the reproduction or the observance to that system. It's still a system that isn't locally derived. And there's very little wriggle room to make the mission system work in diverse communities. So anybody can be captured by it. Local missionaries can be captured by it as much as, Intermountain West missionaries. And this is the question that we always need to come back to. What is the system? Matthew talked about kind of some sort of different experiences with the Lamanite placement program. And I think it's valuable to look at how there's sort of an ambivalence or an ambiguities around and uncertainties around the appropriation of that, the way it constructed identities. But the question needs to come back to what was the system that constructed that in the first place, and does that need our critique? And often, more often than not, the system comes from here and it's transported outwards. So that's what we need to be thinking about, not necessarily how that's experienced by individuals as such, but what kind of critique does the system require?
Janet, as you were speaking Maori this morning, which was beautiful, by the way, you had a series of slides up that were also providing English for those of us who unfortunately don't speak the language of Aotearoa. And as you did that, you identified yourself according to place, and you named your ancestors, and then you spoke to our ancestors. And Moroni, when you were speaking, if I remember the word right, you talked about, was it ech? And you mentioned how that's kind of word of kin, and you said in passing that there is no word for family, as we would say in English in Navajo. And I think that's beautiful, and if I understand very much about the Diné, Navajo are also people of place, people from the Four Sacred Mountains, which is very important, and the origin of lineage groups as also related to place. And so there's a kind of similarity a little bit in what both of you said. And a quick story. I'm a professor here. I teach anthropology. You may be able to tell by the comments I'm making. But I had a student from New Zealand, from Aotearoa, who was not Mormon. He came as a basketball player, big, tall Maori guy. And in class one day, he said to all the Anglo students, he said, or the white students, he said, "I don't get you. Why do you throw your ancestors away?" And, after talking a little bit, because I asked him what did he mean, what he was talking about is the way that we file our ancestors away in the big cave in Big Cottonwood Canyon. And so I was wondering if you could talk more about this notion of place, of ancestors, of ech, not family, because family's big here, but that's the nuclear family that's enshrined in temple services and in Mormon practice. What do we have to learn, which I think is a lot, from what you did this morning, Janet, and what you told us, Moroni, about ech? Okay?
Cool question.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think, let me just start with a personal anecdote. I grew up in the Mormon church and read the Book of Mormon when I was like 11 or 12 and applied what I was supposed to do, got down and prayed, and nothing happened. And I kept going because this was the family practice. We had church in our living room. My father was a branch president in the middle of nowhere. And I never felt connected in any way. And until I went to one of these ceremonies, which is called the Blessing Way. And I'm sitting there all night long with my uncle who is chanting the songs. And one of the songs talks about this deity known as eternal life of goodness and beauty. And the song goes on to say that you as an individual are taken up by a cloud to meet eternal goodness and beauty. And upon that meeting, eternal goodness and beauty says to you, "My grandchild, my child." And it was at that moment that I got connected. And it made sense to me because that song kept saying, everyone is eternal goodness and beauty. And for me, that became the foundation of K'eh, and that is the foundation of K'eh, which came out later, is the recognition of that powerful entity, whatever it's called, that lives and resides and inhabits every living thing. And K'eh has a series of obligations and duties for you to recognize and act in ways that comport with respect to that thing. And so for me, that became the basis of relationality, or that is the basis of relationality, that we are all connected. And so when the Navajo say, or in other words, all things are woven through this relationality. And that meant everything. So the land embodied that thing. And therefore, I had a certain set of obligations to the land. And even though I may be somewhat of an agnostic Navajo, it still is very deep inside of me, that conviction of what that means. And for me, when I get to Mormonism and I get back to Mormonism, I start thinking of the divine in that way, because it makes more sense to me. Because there's a deeper connection to me. When I went through the temple and went through the sealing ordinance, that became more meaningful, because it exemplified that bond around eternal goodness and beauty that was present within my culture. And so I think, at least for me, that can teach us a more expanded notion of relationality, and teach us just better ways of being, I think.
Yeah, and I feel the same way as Moroni. We have a different sort of law, a similar sort of cosmology. And I'm reminded when I come to Utah, you'll have there's an all red, and there's an all red, and there's an all red. And my natural reaction as a New Zealander is to say, oh, you fellas must be related. And they're like, no. I'm like, come on. This is a small community. People kind of got here with hand carts. You're telling me that you have the same name, but you're not related. And there's sort of a blankness. There's this no, probably not. When in actual fact it was probably they all come from different polygamous wives, and everybody's too embarrassed to talk about this polygamous wife thing. And I compare that to the New Zealand situation, where they would say, oh, you're related to Moroni Benally. I'd be like, yeah, even though we're not. Because it's most important that we create relationships. And if I say I'm not related, that means that I've excluded him from the circle of my belonging. And so there is always that posture of, yeah, I am. And I'm thinking about the language, the way that we use language, and kind of coming back to your question of the land and ancestors. So there are some really important words in the Māori language, which is, one of them is hapu, which is to be pregnant, but also it's about a village, an extended family village. So the feminine version of that is pregnancy, but the masculine version of that is a village of belonging. And then the next word is whānau. And whānau is loosely, very loosely, and I think we could use that word that I'm going to practice saying sometime. Whānau is to give birth to, but it also means relationality and family. So the feminine version is to give birth to, and the masculine is relationality and family group. And then the next word is whenua. And whenua is placenta, but it is also land. So in a ritual, you return the placenta to the land, and we say, te whenua, ki te whenua. And that, and the land is the identity of the ancestors, because over successive generations, the whenua has been returned to the whenua, and that gives you your place to stand. And we call that your tūranga waiwai, your place of standing. And so the land becomes very, very important as a marker of your identity and a marker of the ancestors. So, there's that sense of continuity. Once again, I'm reminded also that blessing ceremony. There's a similar blessing ceremony for children. We call that a karakia, which invites that child in spirit form to ascend the ladders of knowledge and awareness and becoming and unity and oneness with the gods and with the ancestors. So, yeah.
Terrific.
I was wondering if you could speak to the uses of gospel culture. I see people in different castes that marry in exogamous marriages that will utilize. They'll say, we don't do his culture, we don't do my culture, we do gospel culture. And it's a resource that is used. So I don't know if you could speak to that.
Actually, I was thinking about that last night because I thought there's a way in which the pressure to adopt a Mormon culture, a Mormon gospel culture, a Mormon identity at the expense of your local identity, there's a way in which that deals sort of benevolently with our diversity. So if we all come here and we say, well, we're just Mormons, that takes away the possibility for any racial or cultural divide that might separate us as a people. So I see some benefit there. But it's kind of it's benevolently meant, but it's violently felt. If you are in a minority culture in which it's very, very difficult to hold on to your cultural expressions, and your Mormon identity collapses into that. So I think, yes, is the answer that, sometimes that can be that can bring people into community with each other. It can resolve issues and tensions in marriages where there's cross-cultural marriage. But there will be an inevitable loss, a cultural loss. And it doesn't need to be a cultural loss. If we in Mormonism developed ways in which we honour each other's cultural differences and a way of seeing cultural differences as an enrichment in relationships and in community, then I think that would be the next gesture. But it never has been. It kind of ticks me off that we've never gone to that place. But I think that's the next thing that needs to be done.
So the one place where it seems that culture is really kind of forced upon Latter-day Saints is through the centralized notion of teaching, right, to youth in particular, right? And so I was thinking of the Strength of the Youth pamphlet that ends up being distributed and used to educate LDS youth. And I just want kind of your reactions, your kind of visceral, maybe, and then thoughtful reactions to those sorts of proclamations in that pamphlet about, appropriate music, appropriate movies, the sorts of body image or dress and attire or piercings and so on that are acceptable and therefore gospel-oriented versus those that are not.
Let me respond to that in two ways. One, just at a personal level. For the Strength of the Youth pamphlet has always been a source of anger and hostility with me, just because I'm a gay man. And I knew that, and it took me until I was maybe 31 to kind of negotiate my place in the church. But during that entire time, that pamphlet represents something that essentially cast me out and did not accept me and made me feel less than every time I looked at it. On another level, from a cultural context, a Navajo context, there is in addition to a young woman's coming of age ceremony, there's also a young man's coming of age ceremony where you go out with a medicine man and you have a ceremonial sweat lodge. And in those moments, they instruct you on on what it means to be a good person under the principles of this notion of eternal goodness and beauty. And that was more meaningful to me. And when I went back and looked at that and tried to ignore the sexual orientation component, there seemed to be some of those things that did cross over, but in the end, for me, it's a very rigid thing. At least within when I go back into my branch and see a lot of the young Navajos are looking at this like, why can't we do these things? It's a list of things to regulate and police their behavior, and it's a set of things for them that in their mind of like, well, we don't want to be these white kids. We want to be Navajo. Why can't we go back to the ceremonies and just follow that? And so there is that operating as well at another level. But
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the issues that we have, and I didn't grow up with the Strength of Youth pamphlet. I grew up with the Young Women's curriculum, which imposed a lot of impossibly difficult behaviours to understand. So, for instance, there was at one stage, I don't know if anybody remembers, there was a young woman's lesson on the need to shave one's legs and underarms. And an overemphasis on what movies we watch. And don't get me started on the petting and necking. We kind of knew what it was, but we feigned ignorance. Like, that's an American thing. So, I mean, for us it would be, snogging and feeling each other up, which went on rampantly, but we weren't necking and petting. So, there was sort of like it came in this cultural fog that asked us to interpret behaviours which were completely, came with this disconnect because we don't come with the culture that supports that. So, for instance, somebody was sharing with me the other day that he lives in Australia where there are 20 Mormons in his town. And a young woman's president, the general young woman's president, came out and spoke to the youth of the region and said, what you need to do is let's light the way to MIA. So we want you to go out and turn on the light so that everybody who's coming back from the ward house can find their way home. Like, with 20 Mormons in a town, you want us to do that? A, we're going to get like moths and spiders because it's Australia. But nobody walks to the chapel. We all have to take cars to the chapel. So there's a nonsense. And so I just want to finish by saying I think that something like the Strength of Youth creates exclusions, and it constitutes young people as policemen and women and gatekeepers for the tradition. And so young people are very suggestible. So they will look at a list of rules and they'll say, yes, now you're not keeping the rule, but I'm keeping the rule. And from a tradition, from a cultural tradition which is very relational, anything that excludes another person is a violence. So somebody might slip up and then suddenly they will be the pariah in the community. So I think it's irresponsible because it doesn't maintain the more Christian need for relationality and belonging and inclusion.
So in order to be more inclusive of all the cultures around the globe, and in your opinions, what is the best case scenario for the future organization of the LDS Church? Is it a single powerful institution? Is it is it a network of autonomous fellowships divided by cultures but united in a discussion of doctrine, something like that? What would be the best sort of organization to be inclusive?
I think you're addressing the big question of Christianity in general. The Protestants are so worried about not having a universal church and everybody's schisming and going off to this, that, the next thing. In my city, you'll be a Presbyterian, go to the Presbyterian one day and you'll be, Pentecostal the next and a Baptist the next because you don't like the pastor. I think they're lamenting that gesture, that the issue of those divisions, that you can't actually get the much needed cohesion in order to make an impact on the world. So that's pitted against the Catholicism, which has always tried to be the universal church, which keeps on falling over itself. And it has such, it takes them, about 100 years to put together what's that thing they had in 1959? They only resolved in 2005. I want to say convocation. What was it? The what? When they had reorganisation of the church.
Second Vatican Council.
The Vatican Councils, yeah. So it's a long haul for them to manage this chaotic community. So I don't know. I don't have any particular answers to that, but we're looking outside of Mormonism. We can be informed by the wisdom and the patterns. I'm not sure that I'm suggesting that we need to collapse all central authority, but I'm not sure that I'm suggesting that sort of flowering in whatever iteration that you want to is actually going to be useful either. And that comes back to the question, what holds us together as a community? What is at the heart of this tradition? And I think that's the question that we need to ask before we talk, answer before we talk about how do we deal with multiple cultural diversity.
Okay, I guess. I agree with what you said. And Moroni, I really, I appreciated you sharing your experience. And same with you, Gina. You talked about ascending the ladder. And the thing is, I find both of your experiences, which are culturally rooted, to be actually very doctrinally sound with Mormon theology, if you really get to the roots of it. But what I find, what restricts finding truth in other cultures would be kind of correlating the system, which kind of happened in the 60s when the church started correlating their teaching programs. So I would agree with that. You'd kind of want to, because you talk about how the church needs to be kind of get back to the Christian roots, and I would say that would be get back to the Word of God, which he kind of answered my question, but I got handed the mic. So I was wondering, would you agree that perhaps maybe the correlation of the churches that are, when I say correlation, I mean the handbook for stake presence, the handbook for mission of presence, the strength of the youth is a subcategory of the correlation committee, trying to correlate everyone's beliefs so they're taught this thing every single Sunday, every lesson's planned out for the month, that perhaps instead of maybe a correlation committee, you send missionaries out, and instead of trying to impose their beliefs, impose their ideology on them or their traditions, so to say, perhaps finding truth in other cultures like the Navajos, the Filipinos, the Chinese, whatever, finding that truth and rejoicing together and coming to a doctrinal understanding. Would you believe that perhaps the correlation committee should be
fired,
deconstructed,
yeah,
fired and done away with? That's my comment. Yeah.
Yes. One of the discussions, so my father's also a professor of indigenous philosophy, and he used to do a lot of work with and convene some native scholars, and they just informally in our living room, and I was just a young kid, and I just kind of peeped my head in and listened. And one of the things that they always and as faithful Mormons, one of the things they always complained about was this idea of learning out of the best books, right? There's a scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants where there's an injunction to learn out of the best books. But they always said, well, but that falls short because Salt Lake City gets to define what a best book is. We do not get to define what a book is. And they said, our book may be our blessing way ceremony. And there is truth in that. And they said, but that doesn't fall within the criteria of best books from this correlation committee. And therefore it is wrong and evil and must be done away with. It is one of the evil traditions that must be, forgotten. But yet, at the same time, the blessing way ceremony is precisely where I got that connection with the divine. And so the answer is yes.
Yeah, and I want to respond to that with just a bit of a historical anecdote. Matthew Cowley is a very much loved leader of the church. I think he was the mission president. I think he may have been a general authority. Was he ever was an apostle as well? And he was a huge advocate for bringing the wisdom, Maori wisdom, back to New Zealand. And he would go toe-to-toe with apostles to say you need to listen to the way that they're understanding what their cosmology and what their... Because it adheres so well. This is why we got so many Māori converts, because they'll be like, yeah, we already do that. And it's the same way that you said it. There was a sort of a cosmology that made sense. And so there was a free... I mean, the church in New Zealand is very much a Māori church at its roots, in which you would... It was quite syncretic. You would bring your Māori tradition and your practices and your customs and ritual and language. And then when he left the mission or passed away, they had a man called Gordon C. Young, who was installed as the mission president. And his brief was to clap down on everything. So within a period of time that he was the mission president, he excommunicated 160 couples because they didn't have official state marriages. They had traditional Māori marriages. And his role was to clean it all up and to make it replicate Utah American Mormon practice. So it kind of leaves us with the question, why would that be? And I think at the heart of it, what we're looking at in the Mormonism as our greatest issue is this dogged desire to preserve authority and control and discipline. So correlation serves that purpose. It is about creating a biddable and a suggestible and a submissive community of people who will do what they... And I think it's because, and I'm just going to go out on a wee limb here, I think it's because the nature of the attachments to certain truth claims differs considerably amongst people like the Quorum of the 15. And so at any given time, we could have, mass deaths in the apostleship. We need to have a community who is disciplined enough and willfully obedient enough, blindly obedient and willfully ignorant enough that they will do exactly what the next person says. That's me on a cynical day, which is most days. So, I think theology is not the big question. We're not grappling with theology. What we're grappling with is the maintenance of authority and the building of a community and a kingdom in which people do as they're told to further the enterprise, and that is at all costs. So, correlation, I would like to see it next, but I would like to see the attachment to the need to preserve a certain field of authority as central to this tradition.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
I was just wondering, over the past 20, 30 years or something like that, can you see signs of encouraging change along the lines that you have spoken in terms of what comes from Salt Lake or the Missionary Training Center, looking for more ways to be culturally sensitive and to think contextually in terms of theology or whatever? In a growing age of, we're all more aware of diversity and pluralism in the society. There can be tendencies to either be fearful of that and pull back or to embrace it, and could you just comment on what you see as trends and maybe a little bit on what you think of in terms of your gut feeling about hopes of the future?
I think the trend is opposite, actually. If I take the missionary program, for example, in the 1970s, there was a concerted effort to teach all missionaries how to speak Navajo, and in that curriculum, they also taught them about Navajo cosmology, so they had a better fit when they got in. Now, none of the missionaries are taught to speak Navajo, which prevents them from accessing, if the church were really meant about trying to do a conversion, it prevents them from accessing about 20% of the population who does not even speak English. And so you have missionaries working in the field who have no, and that is not seen as important for the church, because the church is saying, well, eventually the Navajo Nation's all going to speak English, and they're all going to essentially assimilate under this larger rubric of like multiculturalism. And so, why let the missionaries learn Navajo? So there's this reverse trend. And I also, just looking at my father's experiences as a church leader as well, it's the clampdown on cultural practices has become even more numerous than times before. And the stressing of the need to follow a very specific logic of success. And what I mean by that is, what does it mean to be a successful Mormon? And there's a very specific logic attached to that. And I think Gina mentioned that before, is there kind of middle class person working in with an MBA in some insurance company making money, and house, 2-car garage, something like that. And when you don't, and there's this concerted effort to push that on as if though that is somehow connected to the blessings of God. And there's more concerted effort of that now than even when I was growing up in the church. And I see that even more now than before. And I'm sure Gina will have more explanation of that.
I agree. We both looked at each other and said it's the opposite.
Yeah.
So missionaries going to New Zealand once learned the Māori language, and that was a necessity. I don't think they even touch it in the MTC. I mean, they could, we're a bicultural nation. They could give at least some instruction on how to greet each other, but there is no attention to that whatsoever. So I think in many respects, it's the correlation has washed that identity right out of the church. It's sort of an opposite trend. And I don't know, you asked the question if it's fearfulness. I think so. Because what you don't know is what's going to challenge you to change, and folk around here don't really want to change. Yeah.
Matthew, I'm interested in hearing from you as a historian.
So as someone who keeps being told the archives are ever more open, my requests keep getting rejected. but besides that, I'm thinking about the issue here with, for example, on the Navajo reservation, when they moved away from missionaries learning Navajo and learning Native culture, that there's kind of these two going different directions. There's some folks that are saying this is assimilation to have these white missionaries coming out there, and so let's not be assimilationists. Let's turn the gospel and the church over to the local people and put local people in charge. But at the same time, you have the correlation movement correlating those leaders, and so it seems like on one hand it's trying to move away from this assimilation, but on the other hand it's still happening. Whether local people are in charge or not, and whether it's outsiders that are controlling the church.
And can I just respond to that? Because that causes a violence in the community. It pits people against each other. So there are people who really want to hold on to their customs and traditions and their language, and those people who have been broke by the church and have, become honorary white folk. And so you've got a division in families, and that's the issue. Like, how does the church and its relationships within those communities create exclusions and social shunning and really unproductive family and social relationships? Yeah.
Do we have time for one more, if it's brief?
Okay, the church is very interested in genealogy, and as a result of that, my parents, as I was growing up, we spent lots of family home evenings looking over genealogy charts, and my father only recently had a DNA test done where he found out that he had African ancestry, and he, as a result of that, he ended up doing some more research on a particular family line that we had never been able to research back past his great-grandfather. And what happened was that he found out that his great-grandfather was an African-American who had been passing as white. And he had left behind his family and his place of origin and never told anybody about it because he was passing as white. And this story, this has all come out after 1978, so it hasn't been a problem in terms of now, in terms of the cultural history of the church now. But what it has done to me has made me wonder about the ways in which I am also passing as part of this cultural white Mormonism, and the ways in which everyone is passing as this. And my question for you is that a useful way to talk about the culture, that everybody is sort of passing and everybody is being treated violently? Or is that a way of sort of also culturally taking the narrative from people who are being more treated more violently and whose culture is being sort of smashed and appropriated worse than the way in which I am experiencing being forced to pass?
It's a complex question.
It is. Let me just comment on something that I can't comment on. I know that there is a lot of performance, and what I mean by that is, even now at this point, in this moment, I'm in a performative space. I mean, Hannah Arendt calls this is the space of revealing. We are in a revelatory moment right now as I'm revealing myself to you, but in that it's a very guarded performative aspect in that I'm dressing in a way that facilitates dialogue and conversation with you. And there's another scholar named James C. Scott who would characterize that performance piece as feigned compliance, as a means of survival. And I can't speak to the experience of white folk, but I can certainly speak to experience of myself and also many other Native people and people of color, is that there is a performance aspect, and that performance is out of necessity, out of survival. And it's out of this fear of this constant policing and surveilling of Native behavior, and does that comport with these Mormon notions of what a good Mormon is. And so a lot of them, at least that I know, perform good Mormon as a means of survival because they want to maintain some connection to the spiritual basis of Mormonism, but they have to then, that performance then becomes a vehicle for that, for better or worse. And it's difficult, but it's a matter of survival. And even within that space, there is fear of transgressing those boundaries of whiteness, the rules of whiteness, even within their own communities. And that causes a lot of lateral violence among ourselves. It's like, well, at least for me, I get very frustrated when people of color will not step up and call things out, but I understand why they don't. And there's that performative element. I don't know if that speaks to your question, but that's kind of what came to my mind.
So in looking at the placement program, one of the issues that constantly comes up is that students who go during the school months and they play along and they do what they're supposed to do. Some of them don't, some of them resist, some pull out. But those who continue to participate year after year, they have this mask, right? Shakespeare says we all wear masks. But then during the summer, they return to the reservation, and there's a whole different experience. And occasionally you'll get some white foster parent who, meaning well, goes to visit their foster child on the reservation, and they're horrified and confused by what's going on. And the child is horrified and confused to see the white, because now two worlds are clashing together. And this poor kid that's 8 years old, 12 years old, has to figure out how to make it work because they've been playing two roles. And we all play roles at some point, but when they crash, it gets difficult, I suppose.
And I just have a quick reaction to that, and I addressed it in my talk, that, and I agree with what you say, that there is a performance element to all of our social gestures. And you kind of set up a question, is it this or is it this? Well, perhaps it's both. And perhaps the adoption, the more kind of generous adoption of compound worldviews, not requiring people to be entirely anything, but to inhabit the identities where and when they wish to and how they wish to, that be strategically or not, is a gesture of humanizing people. Asking them to be one thing is the most dehumanizing thing that we can do to a human being.
Well, thank you very much to each of you for sharing your time and insight with us. Please join me in thanking our panelists.